Hello.
How's it going?
Good. How are you doing?
Good, good.
Is it Anatoly? What do you go by?
Yeah, I usually go by Tolly.
Totally. Okay. Awesome. Serious thank you for doing this. This is awesome.
You got it.
Yeah, so I guess are you just going to go through like the typical kind of Dropbox prompt or just a generic prompt that you came up with, or I guess like what's kind of the prompt here?
Yeah, so I guess just to kind of give a little bit of background, I worked for startups for a while. And, startup interviews, you usually talk to like maybe two, three people, and they ask you some basic questions, and they're like, yeah, good enough.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I decided to basically interview for some big tech companies finally. And yeah, it was just like a pretty crazy interview process. Totally didn't know what to expect. Um, and yeah, probably the most confusing part was the system design interview because so I'm a front end developer and I was like Googling system design interview, what to expect. And they're like concurrency systems and all that stuff. And
I
like,
got the same
that
thing.
is
It was
not
like, come
front
on,
end.
no concurrency. Yeah, semaphores. We don't do that. Like,
Yep, 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 yep. But anyways, I was pretty lucky. So I was interviewing for Dropbox and Square, and luckily they did not ask any concurrency questions, but they did have like a pretty open-ended type of prompt. And essentially, yeah, I decided, well, I ended up getting a really great job at Dropbox, which was my number one choice. But I figured like, hey, as long as I have a few weeks to kill, I might as well, make some resources about kind of what I learned. Yeah, so I started this site called Frontend Infra, where I just like wrote down like everything I saw in the interview and everything I could possibly like answer about front end questions. So that's kind of what I'm doing right now. I'm doing a few mock interviews to basically show like, hey, this is what to actually expect in a front end interview. So don't think there's anything out there like this yet.
there's not. I mean, I jumped into Coinbase a year and a half ago and did startups prior to that. And so until I started Coinbase, like hadn't gone through any front end system design stuff either. Like I've given probably 100 of them now. But other than that, I have no experience with system design and front end space. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to get back into this as well. I actually I passed the OA through Dropbox, and then I did the tech screen through Square and never heard anything back. So,
Interesting.
yeah.
Yeah. Well, definitely. So one of the things that I would like to do, is it okay if I record this, by the way?
Yeah, that's fine.
Awesome. So I guess, sort of on my side of the equation, I would love to post a bunch of these system design interviews online and say like, hey, here's the system design site. And kind of on your side, you could absolutely use this to apply anywhere you want and say like, hey, instead of interviewing me or instead of doing a tech screen, you could actually take a look like this is how I approach problems. And it would kind of like, maybe make the difference between like, and all right, let's give this guy a shot.
Sure.
So that's kind of the idea here. And of course, would be happy to refer you to, Dropbox and anything else. Yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Well, again, I appreciate you doing this. I assume probably skip intros since like that's more time, and I don't want to take too much of your time. And you're not really trying to interview or hire me. So yeah. So I guess like, how do you want to conduct?
Yeah. So basically, I'm going to give a prompt that I heard during this interview cycle. Not going to say which company, but
Sure.
yeah, it's one of, the big companies.
What of two? Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, I will basically lead the interview kind of like how I've seen across companies. And, disclaimer, I don't represent any of these companies in any way, and I'm not copying anything they say in any way. Legal, yada, 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 yada.
Yeah.
So yeah, so here is your prompt. So essentially, the client wanted to create this clone of RobinHood. They love how RobinHood works, but they want to make a few little tweaks here and there. We're still kind of in early stages of, figuring out, what we want to build. But for now, we just sort of want to release a MVP, which will allow their customers to buy and sell stuff. So yeah, you, the front end architect, are in charge of basically architecting the front end of the system. So go for it.
So before I get into project requirements, I do want to kind of understand what is the desired. Obviously, you're indexing on my ability to plan and things like that, but what is the desired outcome for this interview? Are you wanting wireframes and whiteboarding? Do I need to provide something like that? Are you wanting just kind of a general overview of everything? Yeah, like what expectation is the outcome?
It's a very good question. So stepping out of my interviewer hat,
Yeah.
Basically what I noticed is the more senior the position I applied for, the less specific questions they asked, and the more they expected you to direct the interview.
Okay.
Yeah, so a lot of startups that I applied to, they would ask like very specific questions. Okay, describe the data flow, describe this, describe that. With more senior roles, so I was applying to a IC6 at Square. They basically didn't ask anything. They expected me to, ask all the questions, direct the flow. So basically, what are you trying to interview for? Like more of a senior level, architect level, staff level?
Senior, yeah.
All right.
Yeah,
So
and the reason oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go for it.
I was just going to say the reason I ask is like I wasn't sure if it needed to be kind of architecting the entire thing, or if it was like you're looking for kind of data flow or state management, components organization, things like that, in addition to technical choices and things like that, or is it really just more of the higher level stuff? So wanted to make sure that I'm covering pretty much everything that you would index on.
Yep. So basically, since this is a senior plus level role, what I'm going to do is at first, I'm going to let you kind of lead the interview and see how it goes.
Okay.
And in the end, I'm going to drill down on specific things that you may or may not have missed based off of what I've seen.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I guess a few things here. Well, going to be a lot of requirements to start. Is there an existing team that I'm working with? Is this a greenfield? I'm assuming it's a greenfield project. Is it a greenfield team as well? Okay. Is this a team of one, a team of how many? Do we know yet?
Yeah, so you will be managing a team of 10 engineers under you. We are going to slowly scale things out, but yeah, within 6 months, you will have 10 engineers under you.
Is 6 months kind of the project timeline as well, the expected timeline for that, or is there a different timeline?
By 6 months, we would like to launch essentially a beta to our customers.
Okay. Am I coming up with processes and things as well for like planning processes as well? Or is this, do we have a product team or a project management team that is kind of already outlined, sprint cadences, velocities, things like that?
So as the architect, we do expect you to be, we do have, a product team, we do have a backend team, but we do expect you to be present and essentially contributing and saying like, oh, actually, for the front end team, we want waterfall instead of sprints, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay. Sorry, getting a lot of the kind of process stuff out of the way, and then I'll start to drill down into the product a little bit more. Is there any kind of QA support? Anything that any team that's capable of writing, synthetic tests, integration tests, user acceptance tests, things like that?
We do have 2 QA engineers, but we are again looking to you for how are we going to write integration tests? Do we need unit tests? When do we put them in? That kind of information.
Okay. And then is there any existing architecture, any existing technology choices that have been made that I need to be aware of? Any existing tooling, including design systems, any APIs that currently exist, or is this 100% greenfield?
Yeah, it's pretty much 100% greenfield. We are pretty much looking to you to pick the framework, React, etc. We are looking, for feedback on how the data architecture will look. So you'll be interacting with the backend team. They're also, starting from scratch. Essentially, yeah, we, of course, we don't expect you to write any backend code, but we do at this level expect you to have a heavy input on all of these parts.
Sure. So I guess given the fact that we're going to be approaching this kind of from an MVP perspective, are there any kind of trade-offs that we can make, internationalization, accessibility, things like that, that we can kind of put to the side in order to kind of focus a little bit more on speed? Or are we focusing more on a full-fledged product? I guess quality over speed at that point.
That's a very good question. And, obviously this will warrant a much longer discussion, but perhaps we could bring out a little Google Doc right now. And let me go share it. And we're just going to take a few notes on, possible trade-offs that we want to take, how long will various features take to implement. Internationalization would be great, but how much can we expect to slow things down?
Sure.
John, architecture notes. Anyone with a link is an editor, copy.
Yeah, like multi-platform would be another thing that we could keep in mind in terms of, something we could trade off full-fledged product over, kind of raw speed. Oh, there we go. Perfect. I got you. Yeah. So, what platforms are we targeting here? Is this going to be just a mobile first web app? Are we looking to implement a native app for this as well? Yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of what platforms we're targeting, we would like to have a Robinhood-like experience. It seems that most of Robinhood's clients are using the mobile app, but we are trying to understand what the trade-offs would be between using something like React Native or Flutter, or coding it native, or just having a web interface. So definitely looking for input there.
Okay. Yeah. So I guess we're pretty much wanting feature parity with Robinhood. And forgive me, it's actually been a while since I've used Robinhood. So making some assumptions here without spending time digesting the product. But yeah, so I guess first and foremost is just kind of the team and some of the technology choices that we're going to make for the team. Obviously we want to lead off with some TDDs, some technical design documents. Hopefully we have something like a product requirement document, things that we've outlined, user stories, expectations for all these different features. I would like to take that product requirement document and kind of try to boil it down a little bit more, or split it up into, more iterable chunks. An application like Robinhood obviously has a lot of features. And so, there's going to be different things that we want to break apart. Obviously, kind of the main feature that we're looking at is an exchange, the potential to buy and sell. And then you have things like placing, limit orders and things like that. You might have some kind of social aspect in there. You're going to have integrations. things like that. And so I want to look at that product requirement, understand at a high level how we can start to break this up, where we can start to actually tie some of these features into direct sprints. And then, from there, you start to kind of point some of these features. Obviously, before you even start pointing and doling out tickets, we have to have technology to work with. So I like to work, if the organization has anything that exists, any technological choices, are we using GraphQL? Are we using gRPC? Are we using REST? Are we using SOAP? Probably not. But are we using any of these things, or are any of these things expectations? I'm going to assume greenfield, probably not. I tend to rely more on backend for how they want to make those decisions, because they're a little bit more informed. Hopefully I can explain kind of the trade-offs on the front end to the back end, so that we can make some of those informed decisions. And from there, kind of the protocols I'll have, the communication protocols I'll leave, to the back end. I guess from there, it's kind of the front end expectations. What tooling do we want to use on the front end? And so again, like if there's nothing that exists within the organization, typically I'll do kind of a pulse check to see where people's strengths lie, and try to align those with where we want to go with our product. Most of the modern frameworks now will do the same thing with a certain level of, or within a certain level of performance of one another. And so a lot of it kind of depends on, what the organization is comfortable with. If there's a VPE, like have they made any decisions? If there's a CTO, have they made any decisions? Or like, has anyone else made any kind of plans for what technologies we want to use? If not, my personal preference, just based on history and what I've been working in the most, is React. If everybody's kind of on board with that, it's the community support for it is huge. The tooling for it is huge. It's fairly easy to hire for. You're not going to see a whole lot of people hiring for Ember anymore. If you're using something like Lit, there's a lot of support for it and a lot of steam behind it, but it still is kind of smaller adoption right now. Angular obviously has a huge community. So there's kind of a lot, and then there's Svelte, but then there's the kind of the bust syndrome there. If Rich Davies, I can't remember what his name is, but he gets hit, like that Svelte is kind of gone. It's also gone through some really big iterations that have broken or have been massively backwards incompatible. So that's something to keep in mind with Svelte as well. Obviously, there's a lot of other technology choices that can be made in terms of the UI framework, but I'm just going to go ahead and call React in this. From there, we're going to want to look at build processes and build tooling. Is this something where we're going to want to work quickly? Is this something where we want zero configuration? Because we're expecting that we're not going to have a need for configuration, where we can use something like Vite? Or is this something where we're going to want a lot of configuration, where we can use something like Webpack? I tend to favor a little bit more configuration over convention, just for long term. So, unless there's considerable concerns with, setting up tooling, I typically would choose something like Webpack. From there, there's also the question of, are we going to use monorepo, multi-repo? I'm not sure if I should really touch on some of that stuff, just because I want to be cognizant of time and start to actually get into product itself. So I'm just going to kind of skip on there. I'll assume multi-repo, things like state management, that really kind of comes down to what our data needs are going to be. I like to kind of start with the simplest You know, and in the case of React, that's going to be something like React Context. You know, we can weigh out Redux, we can weigh out Zustand and Easy Peasy and all kind of these other options and see if they fit where we want to go. But you know, it's easiest to just kind of start with the basic tooling. There's less boilerplate. It's easier to build on top of. We're not really locking ourselves into a single technology at that point in time. It's kind of easier to iterate and grow from if you just start with internal React, you know, tools. You know, I assume, you know, we're going to want routing in this. So we're going to have to look at stuff like React Router, Reach Router, if we want to implement our own. Obviously, implementing our own is going to be a situation where it's going to add considerably to timelines. So, you know, weigh out React Router, Reach Router, see which of those kind of fit the bill. Obviously, any other options that are out there right now. Hopefully, sorry, I guess I should take a step back here and kind of say that I like to kick off kind of the first sprint within all of this as kind of a technology, you know, spike, figuring out what tools exist, weighing those tools out, putting together kind of what we call, there's a framework we use called Rapid, which is basically going through and, you know, outlining the problems that we're trying to solve, what the solutions to that problem might be, weighing those out against each other, getting input from, you know, other stakeholders within the organization and within the team. And so, yeah, I would typically sprint that first cycle deciding on some of those technological choices. Again, though, I want those to be loose so that we can iterate, or not iterate, so that we can treat this a little bit more organically and change as needed, if needed. So yeah, so after, I guess, kind of that first cycle, you know, start to, hopefully we have our product requirements documented. Hopefully we have kind of high level goals. I guess I should also take a step back and make the assumption that product team has set, you know, OKRs, has set objective key results, things that we are going to want to actually see with this product. You know, as an engineering architect, that's not necessarily on me, but I still want to be aligned with that and understand what those product goals are long term, so that we're not working against that, because there is some kind of freedom in engineering as well and what we're creating. So yeah, making sure that those exist before we start at all. I want to make sure that product is completely buttoned up, our goals are completely buttoned up. So I guess we have our product expectations, we have our tooling. So we're also going to want to look at observability. You know, what kind of things are we going to put in place? You know, Datadog, PagerDuty, Rollbar. You know, what services are we going to want to put in place so that we can actually observe things that are happening? What kind of analytics and metrics are we going to put in there? Amplitude, you know, Google Analytics. Like, what are we going to do so that we can observe user behavior, so that we can observe application performance and problems? Hopefully in this time, we can also start to put together kind of some front-end SLAs, you know, for things like first contentful paint, you know, first response, things like that, so that we can kind of set some goals to measure as we build and see where that starts to degrade as we increment on things. So, you know, in this case, I would just go with, again, you know, there would kind of be the technology discovery phase, but just blowing through that, I'm going to go ahead and, you know, say that we're going to use Datadog. You know, we're going to use PagerDuty for, you know, on-call, which we don't really need to worry about yet, but it would be nice to go ahead and put together kind of on-call runbooks and rotation for once we do reach that MVP and we do, you know, hit launch. Let's see, CI/CD, if that's something that, you know, we really want to focus in on, you know, what do we want to automate within the build pipeline? You know, do we want to use things like GitHub Actions? And have a little bit more granular control? Do we want something that's much bigger solutions? You know, Circle. Jenkins, things like that. I typically would go with something like Circle. It's what I've had the most experience with. But again, the kind of technological discovery phase would be a good choice or a good time to make those choices. So yeah, we have kind of, let's see, we have our build pipeline in place, we have our build tooling in place, we have our base technologies in place. From here, we start to kind of look at wireframes, look at designs. We go through kind of a planning and handoff, hopefully, phase. I'm hoping at this point, product has had time to go through kind of their discovery phases. I like to include engineers, at least front-end engineers, in that as much as possible, so that we can understand kind of, or help the product team kind of understand some of the pitfalls that we might face in implementation. Also, it kind of gives us an opportunity to help the product team put together a design system. There's no real benefit or detraction other than speed and time to implement, and not putting together a design system. At bare minimum, we can use something like Storybook just to break out our kind of core components. We also want to, something I completely forgot about. We want to step back and see if we're going to have to integrate with other teams, if we're going to have to integrate with other products within kind of this product suite. If so, if we're going to be breaking a bunch of these features out into kind of parallelized features, something like micro front ends might make sense, so that everybody can kind of manage their own processes separately, and without affecting implementation flow for the entire team. Assuming just kind of the basic features of RobinHood right now, I think it would be a little bit much to implement something like micro front ends. That's seems to be a pre-optimization, but it's also, again, something to keep in mind based on kind of product requirements. Let's see, from here, we start to work with product team and get a good understanding of kind of the product flow, what we want to see out of the product in terms of designs and UX. This also will help us start putting together kind of some API contracts that we can work with our backend team on. What kind of things are we going to be needing to request here? I like to work directly as the architect with our backend team on those API contracts. We can document them in Swagger. If we're using something like proto buffs, those tend to be automatically documented. Also, should take another step back here. I made an assumption that I didn't call out. I like to use TypeScript. Unfortunately, like, that is kind of a necessary, I don't want to call it a necessary evil, but it's a necessary kind of skill in this day and age. So if somebody on the team doesn't know TypeScript, it's a little bit of a learning curve, but I think the benefits massively outweigh kind of the cost. You have auto documentation, you have auto linting, you have code completion. It massively does minimize errors down the road. Sure, it can slow down development at times, but I do think that that pays off on the end result of having a more stable code base. So made that assumption, but just wanted to call that out. So back to figuring out API contracts. Depending on the backend language, if we're using something like Golang and proto buffs, we might be able to build code generation so that we can take those proto buffs, run code generation on them, and actually output React hooks that we can use to interface with the API. That's something that, if we have enough time up front, will pay off dividends in the end. It'll massively reduce it'll increase consistency in how we're consuming those APIs. If you have auto-generated hooks that are interfacing with those. You're not having to worry about what frameworks to use. You're not having to worry about how to, what parameters to pass, what methods this should be. All of that's been outlined in our protobufs. All of that's been, defined by our backend team. Hopefully also covered, those protobufs can be auto-generated into Swagger docs as well. So yeah, that's another thing I like to implement if at all possible. Given the team size, I don't know that that would be entirely possible because we don't have like a front-end platform team that could kind of take that on. So I'm going to kind of take that one back, I guess, given the team size and given the roadmap, that would be a nice to have. I don't think it's something that we can fit in. And so I guess from there, let's see, we have our API contracts. I like to start having front-end team kind of build out our mocked APIs so that, since this is a greenfield project, we are going to be working in parallel with backend pretty much feature for feature. So those mocked APIs hopefully will, keep our front-end team from being blocked at any point in the process. Again, another benefit of something like protobufs is the fact that it's really easy to generate mocked APIs from those protobufs and from those contracts. So from there, let's see, we have hopefully, again, we've put a sprint or a few sprints into understanding what our reusable components are, building out a base design system to work off of. I think it's kind of trivial to make decisions for things like styling, if it needs to be CSS modules or style components or Linaria, all of those things kind of have their trade-offs, and I don't think there's one that really benefits massively over the other. And so it kind of is team preference if there's any existing expectations within the org again. So, I would use something personally like Linaria or style components, but I'm not, I guess, dogmatic about that at all. Also should take another step back, keep getting ahead of myself. Testing platforms. So, what are we going to use for unit testing? What are we going to use for integration testing? What are we going to set up for synthetic testing? So again, our technology discovery phase, we're going to go through and figure some of these things out. Unit test, it's always nice to have kind of a base level unit test as we go along. I was about to say RSpec, going back to Ruby days. Just perfectly fine. React test library, perfectly fine. Yeah, so I like to also in this phase kind of put together expectations for the team of what we would like to see in terms of test coverage. And again, some of that is going to be dictated by our roadmap and our timeline. Unfortunately, testing is one of those things that often gets kind of sidelined as you need to go a little bit faster. But having those expectations up front and having agreement with product and having agreement with kind of top level will help you communicate some of those slowdowns if possible, if you're trying to adhere to testing, your internal kind of testing SLA. Let's see. So from there, yeah, start to kind of iterate on the product. Hopefully we have our product requirements that we're able to take into a sprint and have our grooming processes over, start to point some of these tickets. I think first, again, we're going to start to work on some of the higher level, higher priority features, the actual exchange portion of things. Should also take another step back. Since it is an exchange, data latency and real-time data is going to be something that is of absolute utmost importance. So I'm going to want to work in the technology discovery phase with the backend team to try to figure out, Do we want to use something like WebSockets? Do we want to use servers and events? Do we want to use polling? Probably not for a situation like this, but how do we want to handle real-time data? And is this something that's an expectation across the board? Is this something that, there's really only a couple key points within this application that we're going to need real-time data for? This will also, real-time data will help solve kind of multi-instance scenarios where somebody has this open on their phone and somebody has this open in their browser. They make a purchase in their browser. They need to also show up on their phone. Things like in-app notifications. If we're, so web, I guess, should also go back to kind of the native platform side of things. I'm assuming if we are a small team of 10 engineers, if we have a relatively short timeline for this MVP, it's probably going to be a responsive web app would be the best way to go. That way we're not building out two separate platforms, testing two separate platforms across a relatively small team. And again, going back to the React decision, having React gives us an easy pipeline or relatively easy pipeline into React Native. So that we can spin this off into a native application later on if we feel like we need it. So gonna want to start to also look at, if we're making this decision for a mobile first app, what kind of limitations do we have in terms of notifications, device communication, things like that. I guess that would also be something that would help us decide if we really do need a native application at this time. I realize that I'm kind of jumping around a little bit. Sorry, my apologies. Yeah, so that would go back again into kind of the technology discovery phase. Like, what are the device and platform requirements that we have around this and expectations? So yeah, back onto kind of implementation. We are going to, I guess from here is, do you want me to start working into state management and things like that? Or where would you like to see me go at this point? I don't know if you want me to kind of continue on the higher level portion of things, or if you want me to start drilling down into actual implementation.
Yep. So in the interest of time, like usually these interviews are about an hour and we're somewhere around 40 minutes in. And of course, since this is a mock, it can go over, but just to give an idea. So at this point, you went through the general architecture, which is great. You went through the trade-offs, asking requirements. Just a few notes that I wanted to give before the next part. So I think what you did well is actually going into a lot of interesting considerations. So something I didn't even think of when I got asked this question was this multi-device scenario. Pretty cool. You kind of ticked off a lot of points. Like, since this is a high frequency-ish trading system, you want to take into account latency, stuff like that. You definitely went into, how do we make development easier? So essentially using protobufs, generating those types. I really liked how you went into like, hey, if we want to implement a new technology like TypeScript, not everyone on the team necessarily knows it. And essentially, we might want to budget some time to actually teach everyone this. And this is something that I probably forgot quite as well. Especially once you get into more like staff level and above positions, you're no longer an individual contributor, really. You have to consider, how will this affect the rest of the team from a time perspective? What do people know? What do they not know? What do junior developers, what are they capable of? What are they not capable of? How do we get them to be capable of? So definitely, this was great. And let's see. So yeah, you went through the basics, tooling, observability. Somewhere that I got docked in my interviews was I didn't ask enough questions. So I also have sort of this tendency to have monologues. And I guess like what the feedback I got from a few people, like stop every few minutes and ask like, is this generally, where we want to go? And like insert questions like, all right, CI/CD, what's in place right now? What's important? Essentially ask, I would say like every 3-4 minutes, like ask a question about like, hey, is this generally the right direction? Like that's probably the main thing that I got docked for.
Okay.
Oh, another thing, you did great. OKRs. So making sure that you're actually aligned with product. So a lot of times engineering goes off and builds something and spends a lot of time, but they don't even ask like, well, from the business side, what are we actually trying to achieve? So definitely delving more into this would be great, and like actually asking those questions. Well, what are the OKRs for this product? And that will guide a lot of the decisions. Mock API, testing platform, testing, great. That's also something that's missed a lot. Yeah, and then you went through, essentially why to use a responsive web app. So yeah, I would say it's pretty good. I'll go through a few more details in the end, but this covers a lot of the basics of the architecture side. So the next part of this, essentially the interviewers directed me towards a more micro level. So imagine a scenario like this. So the thing is, our design team is outsourced and they kind of got some screens. They didn't get all the screens. So we really want you to sit down and actually plan through one of the screens with us. So we kind of expect you to account for a lot of the states, the data flow, the API interactions, the handlers. We want to basically see what do you think of in terms of going from a basic concept, like I want to be able to buy a stock, to actual implementation. So you could use Google Docs to kind of draw it out, or Lucid Charts, or whatever you want. Oh, did I lose you? Hello, hello. Testing, testing. Oh, yeah, I think I typed it back.
Oh, there we go. Okay.
Yep, there we go.
Awesome. Yeah, I don't think I've actually drawn much in Google Docs, but I guess I can just, not necessarily pseudocode, but I will just write out, I guess, some of the things that I think about from, I don't want to call them edge cases, but kind of the hidden interactions that you don't think about from kind of base level designs.
Yep.
So let's see, we'll just say user interaction considerations. So things that I'm going to think about are, oh, come on, heading, there we go. Oops. I'm going to think about, first off, loading state. What are my loading states? Obviously, we want this to be a snappy application. If it's things like, RobinHood, they're also going to be dealing with crypto. And as you know, crypto and the market in general can be very, very quick. And so we want to minimize loading states as much as possible so that the user isn't getting hung up on something along the way. So, I guess, and this, we've already covered this, but this would also go back to, is there stuff that we can preload prior to, the user actually hitting the site? That would, again, be in technology discovery phase. But so loading states, I'm going to figure out, what are basic general app loading, we'll call it. So, is there a spinner when the user hits the page and it covers everything up? Do we want to use skeleton components instead of, having a large spinner? How do we want to make this a little bit smaller into, components? So if we have a list of graphs or a list of assets or things like that, and this is loading. Do we want this to be skeleton? Do we want this to be a spinner? What can we show the user that is meaningful for each one of these components while this is actually loading? We also want to minimize layout shift and kind of jar. So the hope is that we can build components in a way that will both be in a loading state and a viewable state, that will not shift our layout all over the place. One of the things we're also going to want to go back and look at, this reminds me, is going to be something like virtualization for things like assets or pagination, so that we're not pulling in thousands of assets or transactions or things like that, and trying to render those on the page at the same time. We're only going to show the user what's meaningful to them at that point in time, whether that's pagination or virtualization or something related to that. So loading states, also kind of transition states. So page transition. I'm gonna go back again to kind of our technology discovery. We don't have a browser list. And so we want to understand what are our target browsers that we're trying to hit. That will also kind of dictate not necessarily our technology choices, but it's going to dictate some of the APIs that we use. Chrome now is coming out with their page transition API that will make things feel a lot more native and its nature, when you're going through your page transitions, when you're going through component transitions, and that's something that everybody else, except for unfortunately Safari, has on their roadmap. So, is that something we want to utilize to make this feel a little bit more native in nature, and a little bit more user friendly? It also, again, prevents kind of the loading snap of going from one page to another. So yeah, our general loading states, general app, we'll just call it app. Components, yeah, we want to minimize layout shift in our components, page transitions, and then I think that's pretty much it for the loading states. We need to, again, hopefully some of these things, if there are any, our component loading states are also, should encompass input loading states. So if there's going to be anything that's, a searchable select or drop down or anything like that, if a user can input text into a text input and hit enter, do we want to show a spinner in that? If a user clicks a button, do we want to show a spinner in that button? So our components are going to be, hopefully high level components like cards with contents, but also, more granular components like buttons and inputs. So hopefully that covers most of the loading states. Similarly, we're going to want to start to cover error states for everything. Let's see. So we'll have error states. Why won't you go back? Shift tab. Okay, there we go. Shift wasn't working. So again, it's going to kind of mirror some of the loading states. We're going to have our app loading states. What happens if a user hits, a 404? What happens if there's a service interruption? you know, what are the various kind of high level eruption? There we go. What are some of the kind of higher level error states that we might see? You know, and trying to load this. And then we'll step through kind of the user flow there to figure out more error states, you know, things like API error. Somebody starts to load the exchange or the transactions or something like that. Their user data comes in fine, but their transactions don't. So, you know, how do we show API errors? You know, do we want to show a toast? And then that component still stays in a loading state? Do we want to have, you know, a fully blocking state on this? Because, you know, there are obviously some API errors that are going to prevent usage for this entire application. So I guess that is kind of a product direction that I like to hopefully rely on product, but you also said this product is outsourced. So hopefully, or I guess we're going to be making some of these decisions. So at this state, I guess then I would look at, you know, what are our API calls, and among those, if they failed, what would be the results of the application? And that will help us kind of drive direction for how we want to look, or what we want these API errors to look like. You know, if they can be smaller, modal, toast, things like that, or if it does need to be a you know, full overlay, something like that. Our app errors are also going to cover JavaScript specific errors, I would think, as well. You know, things like imports, embeds, things like that. If those don't load, what happens within our application? You know, hopefully we're going to be able to catch those with error boundaries and still provide a meaningful experience to some extent to our user. You know, and hopefully we will have the observability also in place, so that we, you know, can see when those things are happening in a service like Datadog or Sentry or Rollbar. You know, any of those will allow us to kind of play through the experience, hopefully. Yeah, so then we have our API errors. We're going to have our component errors, and we'll call those component errors / validations, because we're also going to have, you know, if somebody inputs a username for their account, that error is probably going to, if there isn't a valid user for that, or if a user's already taken, it's probably going to look similar to if somebody has typed in, you know, a bad password. So I'll kind of group component errors and validations together. So we'll start to look at, you know, our inputs, places that we might start to see some of those errors. API errors also start to kind of touch into that a little bit. You know, if you have something like I had mentioned earlier, a searchable select, or an autocomplete, and the API just dies for whatever reason, or if there's invalid, you know, input there, that's probably it's going to be an API error that is actually rendered as a component validation / error. Let's see. So we have our error states, we have our loading states. Let's see, our user interaction. We want to see if there's any kind of motion direction, I guess, as well. You know, to me, that's kind of, that's a little bit more polish / animation. So, you know, this kind of goes back to a loading state, but page transitions. You know, if we have any screens that we want to, or any components that we want to transition into another, you know, button states, input states, if there's any kind of onboarding experience, you know, is there any kind of motion direction or animation expectation within that? That's another thing that I guess I had forgot to kind of touch on earlier was an onboarding experience. What do we want to do for that? Hopefully we also have kind of a user funnel a user funnel that product has given us that we can kind of tie that onboarding experience into. So let's go back to motion direction animation. I think that's pretty much it. It's kind of hard to make those animation and motion direction calls without actually seeing designs for that and potentials. Let's see. So user interaction considerations. I think that's kind of it. We want our loading states and our error states. We want to go back again and figure out internationalization, accessibility concerns, but we've already kind of talked about that at the very beginning, and we need to outline what the expectations for those are in terms of the MVP. What else at this point? Does this seem reasonable? Is there anything else that I need to touch on in terms of kind of user and or UI considerations?
Yeah, so now we want to dive in even deeper than that. And basically, we need to show the client something, basically tomorrow. All the client wants to see is essentially the ability to buy a stock. Unfortunately, the design team does not really have enough time to give you a design, but you kind of have free reign to, make this look like whatever you want. So tell me, show me approximately what this would look like. It doesn't have to be pretty, but we just want to make sure that we have a very, very, very basic functional prototype of being able to buy that stock.
Okay. So let's see, we have a day to do this. Is there drawing capabilities within?
Let's use Lucid Chart.
Yeah, okay.
Or Lucid Spark. I think I actually have a subscription.
So I guess while you're doing this, I should also ask, are we at the point now where, product is asking for this or some stakeholders asking for this? Are we at a point where we have a kind of component or a design system in place? Do we have
Nope.
a base level set of components? Okay.
Yeah, we've got nothing. We've got basically the design team, doesn't have time right now. Yeah, essentially you're kind of working with nothing at this point. And we just want a super, super basic MVP that will be done, let's say in a day or two.
Okay.
And yeah, just roughly draw out what it would look like, and we'll kind of go through how it'll work.
Okay. Can you see what I'm doing?
Yep.
Perfect. All right. So we'll start with kind of our base application. We're probably going to have some kind of header. We're going to have, let's see, it's been a while since I've used, I don't remember shortcuts here, but we'll have, avatar for an account. Obviously, these are things with a one-day MVP are probably going to get skipped. We're not going to have account switching and authorization and all that kind of stuff put in place alongside of the ability to actually buy and sell assets. So we're going to have logo, just kind of generic header here. We're probably going to have, let's see, where are just regular lines without an arrow. Where are regular lines without an arrow? Are there any?
Then you say none, like that. Ta-da.
Oh, okay. I'll just do a square. It'll be easier just to kind of understand what I'm talking about.
Doesn't have to look pixel perfect in any way.
Yeah, so would do, kind of probably like a burger menu type thing, so that we have a pop-out drawer, since again, this is probably going to be more mobile focused. for this, we are going to focus more on mobile platform for our, quick turnaround MVP, since that's going to be kind of our primary focus for the application. So we're not going to worry about things like responsiveness right now, just focus on mobile. So we kind of had our header in place. We have our navigation toggle in place. We would have a drawer that would pop out that would most likely have, various, there we go. Oh, this is kind of funky, but there we go. So, clicking our burger menu is going to bring our drawer over, and that's going to have our, come on, there we go, base navigation. Let's see, that'll probably have, our profile will probably be embedded within our avatar, but we might have, other pages that we want to display in our base navigation that's not necessary for the MVP. For buy and sell, let's see. So we would have our, let's make a list, I guess, of, so our asset lists, and this is going to be real time. We'll have, maybe underneath that, we'll have, if you click on an asset, you can see asset candle graph. Within this asset list, I guess I should also, maybe we have our asset and then a graph and just kind of a snippet. We'll say for maybe last, wow, this is a lot of information. So is this, let me kind of take a step back here. I'm putting a lot of functionality into something that we have a day turnaround for. I'm going to take a step back. Is this stuff that you would want to see actioned upon, or is it just solely buy and sell an asset?
Well, that's the thing. This is kind of on you. We have, let's say, a day or two to basically show something.
Okay.
You tell us what you can and can't show. And,
yep. So I'm going to take a step back here. We're going to get rid of our candle graph. We're going to get rid of our performance per asset. And we're just going to make this our asset. Let's see. And so you click on that. We'll just turn our entire asset list into kind of the full page. I don't think putting together charting libraries, performance history, and things like that is going to be something that we can turn around in one day. So we're going to forego that for now. Let's see. So clicking on an asset will take us here. And this is going to be, we'll just, for quick turnaround time, we'll just do a modal. And so this will be the same page as before. I guess I should go back and just label this, our home / landing / whatever page. So this is also going to be home. With modal. And then this modal right here is going to kind of be our buy and sell modal. So, we're going to have our asset title. We're going to have some inputs. Let's see. So our first input, or we'll show what, let's see, actually, we'll have current price on here, which will also be within the asset details previously, but it also helps to show it here. So we'll have our current price for the asset. We will have an input, a numerical input here for the number that we want to buy for this asset. So, are we buying 5 shares, 16 shares, whatever? We are going to have a estimated purchase price. And this estimated purchase price will include things like fees, if there are fees, which I would assume would be within this app. All of those will be within that kind of estimated purchase price. And then we will have our, we'll have a buy button, buy, and or cancel. Oops. Let's see. So actually, I guess let's take a step back here. So within this, we actually would probably have a tabbed, let's take a tabbed approach on this. So we'll have our asset title, but underneath that asset title, we will have kind of 2 different tabs, one for buy and one for sell. And it'll obviously give us a separate, why won't you move? There we go. It will give us 2 different form fields, sets of fields, depending on the tab that we've clicked. So why, okay. And this one we'll call it buy. So we'll continue with buy here. So these will be pretty similar. There's not a huge need to vary the different kind of flows between the 2, but it is nice to at least make them kind of separate screens so that it's very explicit as to your intention. You don't want to accidentally sell, as opposed to having something that's, like a drop down for whether you want to buy or sell. And then obviously, you're going to have an X here to, come on, close out the modal as well. That will also function in addition to cancel. We're also going to want to cover accessibility, but that's later on down the line. So yeah, here we'll have also our validations in place. So, if somebody puts in a current price that is more than, or sorry, an input that is more than they can purchase, whether that's because of, more funds than they have within their account, or if it's, more units than exist, we'll have kind of our validation within our number as well. We will probably disable, our buy state based on that validation. We'll also turn this buy button, just for sake of time, into our loading state. So when somebody, clicks buy, it will disable our input so that the user can't change that input while that transaction is happening. And that buy button will also go into a loading state. For ease, or I guess for quickness of implementation, speed of implementation, we'll probably put any validation errors just at the bottom of this modal. We don't really have a whole lot of time to flesh out proper error messaging. So, if our API times out, if there's any kind of API errors for whatever reason, we'll just throw, some red text on the bottom here, again, just for single day MVP. And I think that gets us to the requirements of buying and selling a stock or an asset in that day. Is there anything else that is necessary in this requirement? Obviously, sorry, I should also take a step back. This also takes into account, real-time data that is existing from our server, hopefully, that we're getting. This also takes into account optimistic updates. Somebody clicks buy. I guess if we're using WebSockets or if we're using server sent events, we don't have to worry about updating our asset and details list explicitly. That will come from the server, but we will want to show confirmation. So, that might just be a toast that shows up at the bottom. Come on. So we'll just call this success/error toast. So, if a purchase has been made, if an error happens, we can just show that toast at the bottom of the screen. I think that gets us through our requirements. Is there anything else you would like to see in this?
Yeah, so I would be interested in how you would architect this app. So, what would the components be? What would the layout be? I would like to see, what API endpoints does the backend need to build? How do event handlers work? So take me through, what is your plan for developing this in a day? Like, what are you going to build out roughly?
Yeah, so there's would have obviously various portions of the team working on different things. I would probably have I'll start just with bare components. So we'll have our components. Again, this is something that generally would go into Storybook, but for just kind of what we're doing in this scenario, we're not going to put this in Storybooks. I would have probably a single engineer or two working on. Actually, these are really simple. So we would just work with a single engineer to come up with our generic button, our generic modal, our header logo, header logo avatar. We're going to have we'll call it a menu or a drop down for the avatar that comes out of that avatar. So yeah, I would have somebody that's kind of putting those together. Hopefully the API design on those would be really simple. Again, I'm going back to using React context. So I guess I should also call out kind of a state. So we'll call these just our UI components. We'll kind of have we'll just call them our context here, or our providers. So we'll need, from here, we will need our asset list. We'll probably have an asset provider. We'll have, let's see, we'll call it our overlays, and this will encompass toasts. This will encompass modals, and having that in a provider will allow us to do things like chaining or having multiple, so that it's not just a single component state that exists within the asset list. If you're just conditionally rendering a single modal using component state, you're unable at that point to trigger kind of a success or error toast from within that modal that exists within the entire application. Also, you're unable to chain together your overlays for things like onboarding experiences and things like that. So yeah, that's our providers. Our API, we'll look at that. We'll put that over here. So our API endpoints, we'll call them endpoints. We'll just go with REST at this point. So we're going to have our user, and that's going to be our user auth. It's going to be if there's any kind of permissions, which will go into auth. Let's see. So we'll also have well, I'll just say this is Auth. I guess I should also take a step back here. Is Auth expected or assumed within this? Because taking on Auth is a very large task for a single day, unless we want to use a temporary service, something like Auth0 just to get us off the ground, or Firebase, or any kind of one of those like services that we can use just for prototyping. Or are we going to have Auth hopefully in place at this point in time?
So that's a good question. So since we have to build something really quick, we do definitely want to have some Auth. Do you think we should go through something like Auth0 or Firebase, or should we build something bespoke right now? What do you think the trade-offs are? Will we be able to migrate users?
So yes, we will be able to migrate users. All of these services have well, I guess I don't want to speak concretely, but most of these services have amazing tooling for exporting user data and exporting users themselves. So I don't think there's a huge concern for migrating. Also, given the fact that this is internal, we're not dealing with a large user base. And we're probably not going to have a ton of user history that we're going to be porting over. So migration, at least to me, is a low concern, because we're probably going to have 10 people testing this application until we can start getting proper Auth put in place. I don't think we should go bespoke. Again, I don't think timeline will allow that, at least for this quick MVP that we're putting together. Long-term MVP, obviously, yes, want to go bespoke. It gives us a lot more flexibility, a lot more granularity. It's going to hopefully decrease infrastructure and architecture costs. But for this, I would probably use something like Auth0. It's going to give us a couple hour barrier for entry into putting together Auth prototyping. And then also it'll allow us to pull in Google, use Google accounts and things like that, so that we're not having to actually build an account or a user database for these users. Let's see. So yeah, we have our Auth that's going to come through in our user endpoint. That's probably going to have things like roles, permissions. Obviously, we're not really concerned about those right now. We're going to have we'll call them user assets. So that's going to be our current assets for our user that they hold. We're going to have our assets. And then we'll have user assets. So yeah, I don't want to go through the entire set because we're really working on what we need. So we don't need user assets right now, because we're not looking at our personal assets. So yeah, we're gonna have assets. We're gonna have assets ID. That's what's going to give us our current price, our let's see, all the rest of our details per asset, and then we will have we'll have our user asset will post, and so this will be our buy sell. So actually it'll be user asset ID again if we're going REST, and this will be, we'll just call it buy sell. Are you wanting me to kind of outline the structure of these endpoints, payloads, responses, things like that? Because it seems like a little much to come up with kind of even a high level or even an MVP contract for this. But I want to know what your expectations are.
Yeah, so in the interest of time, let's just go through what a buy endpoint would look like. So the payload, responses, etc. And you could be very, very quick about it.
Yeah, so we'll have our request, and that's going to be our type. And that's going to be by cell. That's going to be amount. That's going to be a number. And then I think that's it. So we'll, we just need our type and amount in there because we have our ID, we have our user data. Our response is going to be our, code 200. Well, I don't know in this case what, so I'd have to look and see what potential codes would. Yeah. So we'll just go with 200 or other, whatever other codes would be for this.
Yeah.
Our response probably is also going to include our new amount. So we'll call it total. So that if we do need to optimistically update based on that, we can. We'll have, hopefully we'll also have error message. If there is any kind of server side error that exists in here, that'll be a string. I think that's it for, and then I guess we're also, we don't want to assume this from the request. We're also still going to have our type that comes back through in the response. I think that's it for request and response. Again, this is going to be, well, is this going to be, it might be a put, but I don't want to get bogged down in that either. Okay, so what else? That I think is it for our base API necessary. We need our assets list, which is assets. We need our asset index, which is our asset ID. We need our user, and then we need to be able to buy sell, which is our user asset ID. Yeah, I think that's it for API. So what else are you wanting to see at this point?
So now I'd like to see the basic data flow for, so basically walk me through exactly what will happen in order to make that buy possible. The user loads the app and then what happens?
Okay, yeah, so user loads the app. We are, gonna get our asset list. So that asset list is probably, again, I don't want to go too far into exactly where this would be best placed, just because this is a single day MVP. If our asset list is going to be on multiple pages, we would want to put that provider kind of at the app level as opposed to like a page level. But focusing directly on this, I would put our get assets call within our asset list. That way it's easy just to kind of show a quick loader using, React suspense on our asset list. Then from there, when a user clicks on one of the assets, we're going to have our get asset request that happens loading the modal. Would probably want to handle this a little bit more elegantly so you're not just showing a loading modal long term. But for now, again, just trying to get this MVP up and going, would put that kind of, you would have your modal component, you would have your modal component and you would compose that modal component with, your, we'll call it transaction modal. And that transaction modal would be the component where we would get our asset info. Within that component modal, I would also probably put our logic for handling the transaction itself.
Mhm.
So we would have, an extracted hook that, let's just call it use transaction, and we would have a callback from that process transaction, or, start transaction, whatever we want to call it. And then that would be tied to the actual trigger event would be for that transaction would be in our event handler on our buy button. So let's see. If we have let's go back. We'll have an asset transaction provider instead of an asset provider. Transaction. And that asset transaction will have our loading states, our error states, our triggers, things like that, that we need to provide a little bit lower in the tree. So, our buy button and our input handlers, things like that will go into our asset transaction provider, or that context. Our cancel button and the close button will come from our overlays context or provider, so that we're not having to, prop drill and pass all these callbacks through the entire tree from our transaction modal. So again, yeah, each one of these components in here would be hopefully its own component. Our current price would be a current price component, and that would just pull directly from our, actually, let me go back and think about this. So we need asset transaction, and do we need an asset? I think we also still need our asset asset provider as well. So our current price would pull directly from our asset provider. The input number would set state on our asset transaction context. The estimated purchase price would be derived state based on, well, now we have asset and asset transaction. So maybe, and then also our estimated purchase price needs to be real time, I would assume. So instead of trying to keep that in both asset and asset transaction, let's put our asset as a resource within our asset transaction, so that we're not having to reference multiple context from each other. Yeah. All right. So going back, our input number would interact with our asset transaction or asset transaction context. Our estimated purchase price would be derived state based on the asset transaction, input number, and the asset resource total per current price. And then our buy, on click handler or on press would also come directly from our asset transaction. So that would be, a submit callback that would happen there. Our loading states, again, for the buy button and for the disabling of our input would come directly from our transaction, asset transaction. I should also go back, the buy and sell, the type that we are currently on would also be within our asset transaction. Our error states that happen within the API, if anything comes back as an error from our request or success comes back, that would be, handled within our asset transaction. We would probably have a success flag, an is error flag, and then our error messaging would also be handled in there as well, because we would probably want more meaningful error messaging that comes directly from the server. And I think that's it. So then it's also easy to tie in our overlay callbacks on that, so that after we await success for our buy transaction, we close the modal, we show a success toast, those kind of things. And I think that's the general user flow and data handling for, or data flow for buy and sell flow. Is there anything else that you would like to see from that?
Yeah, I think that more or less was pretty good. I think you covered at least the most important parts. So yeah, definitely what I saw asked was, yeah, to first like sort of, either sketch or like give an idea of general components we'll be dealing with. So you did a pretty good job there. The common components, yeah. Something that would be great to see is sort of a component tree. So in the component tree, you would say, all right, the home component, the home page component, underneath it has the navbar component, the asset list component, and then you actually say like, all right, I will put my provider up here. I will put my action handlers here. This is where the API request actually gets triggered. This is when the API request actually gets triggered. And then I would go through, not every single component, but all the components necessary in that very, very basic flow, and basically do the same thing. Like, which provider is it using? What actions do I expect to happen? And what are the outcomes of each action? So essentially on click buy, what will happen when I click on buy? Is it going to set off an event handler in a provider? Is it going to set off some drill down event handler? How does the component know what actually ended up happening? Did it succeed? Is it loading? So really illustrate, where is it actually getting the state and how is it passing the state back to where it needs to go? Something to consider. So I personally like to go with a very like storybook based approach where the components that you're building are as dumb as possible. So all they would never be, calling a context directly unless they're like sort of on the page level. They will simply accept, data in for the state, and they will accept handlers to call like, oh, I want to buy something. These are the parameters of what to buy. They have no idea what the API looks like. They have no idea if we're using Axios or if we're using GraphQL. And that way, like in Storybook, we can very, very easily test something out. And if we decide to put it in a totally different system, which has a totally different, API structure or whatever, we basically don't have to re-architect this component from scratch.
Sure. Yeah. And that's kind of the, and I guess I had implied it, but I wasn't explicit about it. The kind of UI components that I have here are dumb components. Well, I had mentioned we would have, kind of our transaction modal that would compose our modal. We would have, our buy button would compose a regular button. Same thing for, cancel button, our inputs and things like that. These wouldn't just be the, regular UI component. It would be kind of, composed, a set of composed components that are consuming that context within them, or that provider within them. And that, so still do have kind of our storybook components and our dumb components, but then you also have our specific use case components as well.
Yep.
Which I think, years ago would have been, called a little bit closer to like container components.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. But overall, yeah, I think you got pretty much most of the nice parts. Depending on the company, some companies seem to ask more of this, less of that. Like one company I interviewed for really drilled down into the data structure. So they wanted to know the ins and outs of, for example, what does this endpoint look like? What are all the possible error states? What can I expect? Like if this error state happens, how are we going to handle it? If that error state happens, how are we going to handle it? So that might be something you want to go into. But again, like you can't, possibly cover everything in an hour. So I would ask like, so another consideration we might have is all the possible error states. Do you want me to go through all of this? And depending on what the interviewer cares about, they'll say like, yes, I want you to talk about all the error states, or no, let's go on to the next item.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's, we're a little bit over an hour and a half here. Yeah, and trying to cover all of those things definitely is a concern, and trying to figure out what they're indexing on the most. At Coinbase, we have a very solid rubric of here are the things we're measuring against. And I, as an interviewer, I try to be a little bit forward about what those things are, so that the candidate has a little bit more insight into where they should index and where they should just kind of move on a little bit quicker. But obviously I can't speak to any other organization outside of that, and I don't know. So yeah, I guess can I ask specifically for Dropbox if they were forward about sorry, I realize you're recording, so maybe not. Yeah, maybe I won't ask that question.
Well, yeah, I could tell you like later on kind of the specifics without breaking NDAs too much. It's still like,
yeah, not specifics, just more just like, were they
Yeah.
forthright and what the expectations were? Like, I don't want to know any details or specifics, just kind of, were they communicative in terms of like, here's what we expect out of this?
What I can say, so from feedback given and from seniority of roles that I applied to in different companies, like the more senior you get, the more you're expected to ask those questions instead of like be guided. So for a lot of startups, for example, they will literally ask you like, all right, how does this work? How does that work? How does that work? Versus like when you get up to more like staff level positions, essentially like it's really up to you to ask those questions and direct the flow. And for the interviewers to say like, oh, actually, I care more about this. And the reason for that is not because they're trying to be assholes, of course, but because they want to like really see like how you prioritize and how you communicate. Because you could have like all the knowledge on page optimization in the world, but it's kind of useless unless you know when to like use that knowledge. I'm not going to spend 6 months optimizing page load if they don't even care about that. But they wouldn't even know unless you ask like, hey, here's something to consider, page load. These are the things as a non-engineer that you have to consider from a business point of view. Like I could spend 6 months building the fastest page load in the world, but it has these trade-offs. So like a lot of the staff level responsibilities are asking non-technical people, hey, given everything I know about tech, what are the business things that we have to account for?
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. That, I mean, cool. Again, I appreciate everything. What I guess you kind of gave me some initial feedback. Any other feedback that you have for me?
Let's see. Yeah, there are a few things you said which were really interesting. And by the way, I'm taking notes as well. So I'm building that. I'm building like a version as well as like a video version of this. But yeah, some really interesting stuff. Never heard of the page transition API. Gonna check that out. This is
actually really cool.
Yeah. I think like calling out like these kinds of weird considerations, like, oh yeah, like if you have loading states and just have like a loading spinner, it'll look really, really ugly when loading. So even mentioning without going into details, like, oh, layout shift, it's like, oh, interesting. This guy has probably been doing development for a while versus, just did a tutorial. This is something pretty important, especially in financial apps. So essentially, like if you click a buy button, you do not want to click that buy button twice by accident.
Yep.
So you want to like mention, all right, we probably want to disable it. We want to, like if there is a transaction in progress on the back end, like we might actually want to communicate it. So another thing that you mentioned.
Yeah, I think I mentioned that with disabling
Yeah.
the buy button and then also disabling the input. So the input itself couldn't be changed while that transaction was happening.
Yeah. But yeah, another thing that you did mention before was like cross device or cross page. So if I have a long running operation, so a lot of times like a buy request, it actually isn't completed all at once. Not that, that's common knowledge, but yeah, you might buy like a few shares, then a few shares more, a few shares more, and then like maybe 5 minutes later, the full buy operation is complete. So in the meantime, user might refresh the page and they're like, oh, well, I guess this transaction didn't go through. Let me buy again. And now they're buying double. So, not that this is expected, but like basically thinking through these types of scenarios definitely shows the interviewer like, oh, interesting. You really thought this through. Some companies will actually give you a prompt ahead of time of what you're trying to build, which well, you would think is an advantage, but the disadvantage.
That makes it harder.
Yeah, you're also expected to like really consider like, well, all right, if I am building, this financial system, what are some weird things that I might have to consider? And that's the interesting thing about engineering. Like it's not a product's job to tell you like, oh, here's a scenario you might have to account for. A lot of times as an engineer, you have to like bring that up like, oh, what about like this long operation?
Yep.
A lot of times product people don't have the technical knowledge to even understand what that is to begin with. But
yeah, user stories are base level requirements. They're not detailed sets of edge cases.
Exactly. And a designer certainly wouldn't, anticipate something like this. Yeah. But yeah, the more senior you get, like a lot of times you're, especially if you're like, OG finance dude, like you're hired for all this weird institutional knowledge you have about finance. Not, necessarily how stock brokerage works, but the technical side of how stock brokerage works.
Sure.
So that's cool. Yeah, you did a great job about error states, how error boundaries work, like what you want to handle there, blocking errors versus non-blocking errors. So, some things are like, hey, like this operation failed, you might want to retry it. How do you retry it? Going through that would be interesting versus blocking, like, I don't know what happened here, contact support. Yeah, validation.
Cloudflare is down just like the other night and killed the entire internet. Yes.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, animation, really cool thing. I personally haven't dealt that much with animation, but if you can, say like, hey, would you like to know about animation? Could get you some points.
Sure.
At the end of the day, like, there's really no right or wrong answer in a system design interview. It's not like they have a checklist of you got to check these 10 things. It's more like really seeing kind of the breadth and depth of your knowledge and your maneuverability of like, all right, how do I ask the right questions to understand like what the client is looking for? The client being sure. Product, whatever. Migrating auth services. Yeah, using external providers is a really big thing. So, you're not going to build everything from scratch. So it's really great to discuss like what are the trade-offs of using Auth0 versus rolling your own. And of course, there's a million schools of thought on this. Google likes to roll their own for some reasons. Other companies like to use providers for some reasons. So having that back and forth discussion would be great. Like, all right, what do we actually care about here? Because sometimes Auth0 will actually provide all sorts of things that you wouldn't even think of. CAPTCHA stuff, WAFs, like all sorts of like weird validations. Yeah, like one startup, I looked into like everything Auth0 does, and we were building a financial software, and we're like, there's absolutely no way we would have considered like half of this stuff.
On the integrations, like it takes care of all that stuff for you a lot of times. So
yeah. Yeah, another cool thing about integrations, and again, like the more senior you get, the more you'll be expected to do this. How do you interface with vendors? So are we going to like buy a package from Auth0 to help guide us integrate this? They like charge something like 25K to do an integration for you, but there are a lot of advantages, especially if you're like doing a financial product. Yeah, so do we want to spend our own money? Do we want to hire a consultant? Do we want to hire a third-party vendor? Like definitely this comes like way higher on the chain.
Which also calls out kind of another thing that I missed, which is like, who are the consumers of this? Like users, RobinHood users or whatever we're calling, obviously are the users of this, but are we going to have a public facing API for anything? Are we going to provide integrations for anything? Like, or is this just our base app for our users? That's all we hope to reach right now. So yeah, that's one thing I forgot to call out.
Absolutely, yeah, that's a great point. I think I missed that as well in my interview, but yeah, like I tend to build APIs that are open from the start, as in they could theoretically be open.
Sure.
But yeah, that's definitely something to talk about. And who is the user is actually a super big part. I'm going to go through like the document that I created later on, and yeah, there are a few things to consider. Optimistic updates, another like cool bit of knowledge you can sprinkle. Where yeah, we kind of discussed that. Yeah, so I'm gonna basically, so essentially like as I do more of these interviews, I'm well, first of all, gonna be posting the videos, but second of all, I'm gonna be updating like this guide. Right now it's like kind of a mess. So I'm just gonna be like picking out little things and say like what you did, what you didn't do. So first I go through like a development roadmap. So I want to give the interviewer an idea of like, this is what I'll be doing, on a very high level. So getting the team on board, like talking to everyone and seeing what they know, doing a rough data architecture with the backend. I want to do an MVP design review. So sit down with, designers or product and in the example I gave, at the very least, I want a sketch before building anything. Any dev conventions / boilerplate. So what you said in sprint 1, we want to basically identify those, components, authentication, etc. You touched on this, super important, especially like if you're going to be, so I'm going to be on the growth team at Dropbox, which is literally like, that's my job kind of.
Yep.
And this is like a topic on its own. You touched on it with the user funnel. So like, yeah, one company I worked at, we went through something like 6 or 7 redesigns of the onboarding, because that literally is what sells. Once the user is on board, they're like, well, guess I'm sold, whatever. So yeah, like
already paid for the service, might as well stay here.
Yep. So definitely asking like, hey, is this something we want to focus on? You could like show quite a lot of knowledge there. Proposing the stack, obviously dependent on what you have right now, what you don't have, like talking about trade-offs, style guide, etc. Storybook you touched on. This is not organized, by the way, so yeah, you talked about testing approach, unit testing, performance trade-offs, protocol trade-offs. So, you don't have to do everything over sockets, for example.
Yep.
Auth, we talked about. Charting, again, like something you could ask about.
Dependencies,
If you want to know about charting. like I spent a ridiculous amount in data visualization, so I could like talk for 10 hours about charting.
I could not. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, a lot of it, there's nothing categorically that you need to say or not say. Like my biggest problem during the interview was not asking enough questions. So
Sure.
you definitely want to ask questions like, hey, do you want to know about charting? Hey, do you want to know about this? And like if you're talking for 10 hours about charting and they don't care, you failed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I went through this entire thing multiple times already. And yeah, it was super helpful for this and just in general. Yeah, there are a lot of things that I guess I wouldn't have thought of for system design that did come up in this document.
Totally. Yeah. But yeah, I guess like pretty much everything else, like I think you didn't focus quite as much on the non-functional, so product requirements, which again, depending on the role, they may or may not care about. So like really identifying like what the user profile is. You basically didn't ask too many questions here.
Sure.
Let's see.
And I guess my assumption there, and it probably should have been an assumption that I called out, is I was assuming the same user as RobinHood. You know, if somebody's saying, let's make a RobinHood clone, or let's, you know, make a Coinbase clone or a Google Calendar clone, I'm assuming that they want the exact same users as that service. But that is an assumption, and I should have called that out. So yeah.
Well, actually, whenever somebody like tells me, oh, it should be just like Robinhood. Well, the thing is, Robinhood is already great at being Robinhood. Robinhood has a ridiculous amount of money. So you're not building Robinhood. You are doing something that's fundamentally different from Robinhood if you actually plan on being successful. So your job is to ask, you know, all right, what are we doing different from Robinhood? Like, what is sort of our competitive advantage? Now, depending on like what role you're interviewing for, they may or may not care. Like this definitely, you know, falls into product manager territory, but you know, it's something that you just kind of have to feel out. Yeah, something you might want to talk about is like, you know, how are we going to refactor? This is something that actually comes up quite a lot in every single company I've worked in. Like we say like, all right, we're going to build it perfectly from the start. No, you're not. So, you know, having that discussion is really important. Yeah, analyze, basically get to know the competitors. You know, it's not your job, but, you know, at least have a general idea. A lot of people miss admin interfaces. So how are you going to do user administration, billing? One company I worked for, we didn't have the ability to bill our clients for like a year. So we're like, we'll bill you, trust me. And they're like, okay.
This is actually what I work on at Coinbase is admin tooling. So yeah.
Exactly. This I'm sure you read through. There's like 10 trillion different things, and obviously you can't talk about everything. I'm definitely going to organize this, and I think you gave me a lot of nice points. Design systems, I think, you know, you gave a basic idea, but, you know, basically explain why design systems are important. This is very unorganized, but, you know, I'm going to go more into various topics, containerization, etc. Right. So here's another part. You know, the system design interview, and I should probably actually make a page about this. So the system design interview, at the end of the day, it doesn't, you know, test any specific knowledge, but it does want to test a few items. First of all, you know, thinking on your feet and asking questions. So we kind of went through that. And basically, pretty much every system design interview I went through, it kind of goes through like this drill down type of approach. So we start very broad with essentially, you know, what is your process? You know, organizing the team, talking to people, you know, sprints, etc. Then you want to talk more about the tech product considerations. So essentially, well, what do we care about from the product angle, which in my opinion should come first. And then based off of the product we're trying to build, what do we have to consider on the tech side? So once we have that, generally the interviewer tries to push you to, all right, so what are we building specifically? So we go into essentially a wireframe. And yeah, pretty much there was one interviewer who provided me with like a rough wireframe. And then there was one who said, draw a wireframe. You might get one of those two. But always good to be able to draw it. And especially if you're giving that prompt ahead of time, you might actually want to draw it. And there's so much that you'll miss, like when doing it, just in your head or text, which you won't miss through the wireframe. So you have the wireframe, and then they basically want to go through the component architecture, so how everything is laid out. And then they want to do the data architecture. So they will, list endpoints, and then, go into detail on one endpoint, and you want to do like all possible states. And what am I missing? And then like a sort of state architecture. So, where are handlers contexts? So essentially, this is kind of the, this is sort of what they ask, and what they're looking for is much more important. So especially the more senior you get. So essentially they have signals of various things you're good or bad at. And there's no like, oh, you mentioned this thing, so you get a checkpoint. It's more like, how often do I see him asking questions and actually getting to know. Another thing,
taking suggestions. Yeah.
Collaboration is something. So I basically got the high end of IC3 role at Dropbox, which is like senior basically. But basically a few people I got in touch with said, I could have made an IC4, but I didn't show. Whoops, did it? Essentially I didn't show enough signs of collaboration. So essentially what they're looking for in collaboration is a lot of what you covered. So how am I actually going to be working with the team? So I'm not just an individual contributor. They want to know like, all right, how am I distributing work to junior engineers, to senior engineers? What are some considerations like, oh, not everybody knows TypeScript. So that is actually, something important for, kind of staff level positions. What else did they tell me? Ability to handle confrontation, or not confrontation. There's probably a better word for it, confrontation. So they look for this both in system design interviews as well as behavioral interviews. But basically they want to know, all right, like show me like when you have an opposing opinion, how are you going to handle it? Is it just like, you know what, I like React context, I hate Redux, and that's the end of it? Or how are you going to talk through? So in the system design interview, you're kind of expected to drive a conversation. Did I freeze up again? Testing.
No. Maybe. No.
Okay, I think we're back.
You there?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, sorry about that in Nicaragua right now.
Oh, no worries. Oh,
But yeah,
that's awesome. I do need
yep,
to wrap up
yep, yep.
as quickly as my kids are getting up from nap, unfortunately. So
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot. Yeah, this was really useful to me as well. And yeah, definitely let me know if you have any other questions. And I would be happy, to do another interview with you and any of the other like coding,
mhm.
et cetera, interviews.
I think behavioral is probably the one that I'm like most concerned
Mhm.
about because it's been a while since I've gone through behavioral, and that's one that I don't give, as an employee. And so it's the one I'm most out of practice with as well. Kind of like you were talking about collaboration, confrontation, um, you know, identifying periods, places of growth, places that I've failed, things like that. So yeah, that's one thing I need to go through is kind of the behavioral stuff. But man, I absolutely appreciate this so much, both on a community, front, like what you're doing for, all of us, and then, what you're doing for me specifically. So thank you so much for putting this together, for putting all this documentation together, for, putting these videos out there. That's awesome.
You got it. All righty.
Yeah, pleasure to meet you, and enjoy Nicaragua.
Will do. Bye.
All right, see you.